There's a trillion-dollar company sitting less than 200 kilometers from its biggest geopolitical risk. It doesn't sell chips. It doesn't design them. It just manufactures the world's future. For everyone. And in the next minutes, you'll see how one quiet decision turned an island into a global choke point. Sometime in 1987, Morris Chang sat across from Taiwanese government officials in Hsinchu and explained, with a precision that bordered on the mundane, what he intended to build. Not a company that designed chips, not a company that sold them. A company that would manufacture exclusively chips designed by other people. The room was not exactly electrified. The model had no precedent. There was no proof it would work. And the initial capital came in large part from the Taiwanese government itself, a bet placed on an idea that by the standards of the time felt more philosophical than industrial. 4 decades later, that decision, that quiet wager on a business model the rest of the industry had dismissed as impractical, sits at the center of one of the most consequential strategic dilemmas in the global economy. Not because the company failed, but because it worked in ways that nobody, not even Chang himself, had fully anticipated. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known universally as TSMC, today controls more than 90% of global production of advanced chips below 10 nanometers. Its share of the pure-play foundry market, manufacturing chips for third parties with no proprietary design, has oscillated between 67% and 71% across recent quarters, depending on methodology. Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm, Broadcom, all of them depend on the same company, all of them depend on the same island, and that island sits less than 200 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. What Morris Chang understood, decades ahead of the industry, is that manufacturing advanced semiconductors is one of the most capital-intensive industrial activities that exists. The equipment required to print transistors at nanometer scale costs hundreds of millions of dollars per unit. A single extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, produced by the Dutch company ASML, the only manufacturer in the world capable of building them, exceeds $300 million. There is no substitute. There is no second-tier alternative that delivers the same output. Chang concluded that no design company could sustain on its own the pace of investment that scale demanded, and that a dedicated foundry, consolidating orders from dozens of different clients, could reach production volumes that would make the cost per unit sustainable. The logic was simple. The execution was anything but. Through the 1990s, as the PC industry accelerated and demand for processors grew in irregular surges, TSMC built its reputation around a single promise: deliver chips on schedule, with consistent quality, and never compete with its own customers. That last point was not trivial. Intel, Samsung, IBM, all the major vertically integrated firms of the era designed and manufactured their own chips. TSMC guaranteed it would never enter the design business. It would be permanently only the factory. That neutrality became a competitive advantage. Companies that hesitated to share sensitive technical details with a rival had no such hesitation with a pure-play foundry. The model attracted clients. Clients generated volume. Volume financed reinvestment in technology. And reinvestment in technology produced the technical lead that eventually left every competitor behind. In the 2000s, something shifted in the scale of the problem. The iPhone, launched in 2007, was not merely a consumer product. It was an industrial reorganization event. Suddenly, billions of people needed high-performance processors in a miniature form factor with severe thermal energy constraints. That demanded increasingly fine lithographies, increasingly smaller transistors, and manufacturing processes that, at that point, only TSMC could deliver with consistency. Apple was among the first major companies to migrate entirely to the fabless model, designing its own silicon and outsourcing fabrication entirely to TSMC. The partnership became structural. When Apple launched the A4 in 2010, the chip was manufactured in Taiwan. When the company transitioned to its M-series processors for MacBooks, the same fabs in Hsinchu were at the center of the operation. Nvidia followed a similar trajectory. Its GPUs, known through the 2010s primarily for gaming, became the backbone of artificial intelligence computing, when researchers discovered that the parallel processing architecture was ideal for training machine learning models. In 2023 and 2024, with GPU demand exploding due to the generative AI boom, Nvidia depended on TSMC for virtually all of its advanced chip production. Jensen Huang, Nvidia's CEO, put it directly in a statement that circulated widely. Without TSMC, there is no Nvidia. The line was not rhetorical. It was a precise operational description. The decision at the center of this story was not made in a single meeting. It consolidated over decades of incremental choices that, each viewed in isolation, appeared rational, and that, taken together, produced a concentration without parallel in modern industrial history. The issue was not only that TSMC manufactured most of the world's advanced chips, it was where it manufactured them, and why. Taiwan offered advantages that were difficult to replicate. An engineering base built across generations of specialization, a supplier ecosystem that had formed around the fabs over decades, geographic proximity to the major Asian markets, and a government that, since the company's founding, treated semiconductors as a national strategic priority, not merely an economic activity. Concentrating advanced production in Taiwan reduced costs. It accelerated innovation because engineers, suppliers, and clients could collaborate with low geographic latency. It protected technical know-how. Keeping the most sophisticated processes within a single industrial cluster made replication by competitors harder. And it created economies of scale that a geographically dispersed operation could never match with the same efficiency. The cost of that concentration was not invisible. It was simply deferred. And during the years of uninterrupted growth, nobody had a real incentive to quantify the deferral. In August 2022, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, landed in Taipei. The visit was symbolic, at the outer edge of diplomatic protocol. Beijing's response was not symbolic. The People's Liberation Army launched large-scale military exercises around Taiwan, the largest since the Strait crisis of 1996. Dozens of warplanes crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait, the informal aerial boundary that had maintained a degree of operational separation between Chinese and Taiwanese forces for decades. Warships conducted blockade simulations. Ballistic missiles were fired on trajectories that passed over Taiwanese airspace. The message was deliberate and specific. Beijing was demonstrating that it had the technical and logistical capacity to interdict the Taiwan Strait. It was not announcing intent, it was displaying capability. 2 years later, in May 2024, with the inauguration of Taiwan's new president Lai Ching-te, the Chinese military repeated the exercise, this time with an addition. The maneuvers included for the first time areas around the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, controlled by Taiwan and located only a few kilometers from the Chinese mainland coast. The gradient of the demonstration had expanded. The operational zone had grown. For markets and governments, the images from the 2022 and 2024 exercises were not merely geopolitical news. They were supply chain risk data. And the numbers associated with that risk were of a magnitude that demanded a different quality of attention than they had previously received. Manufacturing advanced semiconductors is not an activity that can be transferred geographically in a matter of months. Building a leading-edge fab takes 4 to 6 years, depending on scale and complexity. Recruiting and training engineers with the level of specialization required to operate these processes takes longer still. And the accumulated know-how that TSMC has developed over more than 3 decades of operation in Taiwan is not documented in transferable manuals. It is embedded in practices, in local supplier networks, in adjustments made by technicians who spent years calibrating specific equipment under specific conditions. This means the risk is not only military. It is not only the risk of invasion or open conflict. A naval blockade preventing the export of already manufactured chips would produce impact within weeks. A severe political crisis disrupting supply routes for materials, specialty gases, substrates, precision chemicals that enter the fabrication process could halt production lines before a single shot was fired. The Semiconductor Industry Association, in an analysis conducted at the request of the Biden administration, projected that a prolonged interruption of Taiwanese semiconductor supply would reduce U.S. GDP by 11%, an impact twice the scale of the 2008 financial crisis. The reduction in American GDP would be equivalent to approximately $2.5 trillion. Chinese GDP, according to the same analysis, would contract by 16%. An assessment by the Institute for Economics and Peace estimated the cost of a full conflict at up to $10 trillion to the global economy. Even a blockade without open conflict, simply the maritime interdiction of Taiwan, was modeled as a $2.7 trillion shock to global output in the first year. The decision that cost billions, as an analytical concept, is rarely called upon to process magnitudes of this order. What is at stake here is not the collapse of a single company. It is the potential simultaneous interruption of multiple industrial chains that were not built with an alternative. The cascade effect of a TSMC disruption would not be confined to the technology sector. Advanced chips are in smartphones, but also in modern automobiles. They are in data center servers that sustain financial applications, healthcare systems, communications networks. They are in weapons systems. They are in diagnostic medical equipment. During the semiconductor shortage of 2021 and 2022, triggered by the combination of suppressed pandemic demand and disrupted global logistics, the global automotive industry lost the production of approximately 7.7 million vehicles. That was a moderate, transitory shortage of relatively simple chips used in control components. An interruption of advanced chip production would operate at an entirely different order of magnitude. Electric vehicle assembly lines, which depend on high-performance processors for battery management, and assisted driving systems, would stop within weeks. Data centers processing artificial intelligence applications, model training, real-time inference, natural language processing, would have no replacement for graphics accelerators without TSMC. The American defense industry, which depends on leading-edge chips for guidance systems, communications, and image processing, would be in a position that Pentagon analysts have already described internally as structurally concerning. The decision that cost billions in this context is not a metaphor. It is a conservative estimate of the cost of minimal disruption. The maximum impact estimates are an order of magnitude larger. The world's response to this risk crystallized more visibly from 2022 onward. The United States government passed the CHIPS and Science Act, committing $52 billion to subsidize semiconductor fab construction on American soil. TSMC, under pressure from Washington and from its own customers, announced in 2020 the construction of a fab in Arizona. In March 2025, that commitment was expanded significantly, $165 billion in total U.S. investment, 6 planned fabs, 2 advanced packaging facilities, and a research and development hub, the largest single foreign direct investment in American history. Japan approved subsidies to attract TSMC to Kumamoto Prefecture, where a first fab began production in 2024. The European Union launched the European Chips Act, with a stated goal of increasing Europe's share of global semiconductor production. India opened negotiations to attract players from the sector. These moves were presented as diversification strategy. Technically, that is an accurate description. Operationally, it is an admission. No government commits tens of billions of dollars in industrial subsidies without acknowledging that the problem it is trying to solve is real and serious. The speed of the announcement said by itself what the official communiques avoided stating plainly. But the speed of announcements does not correspond to the speed of execution. The Phoenix fab took years beyond its initial projected timeline to enter production. The technical knowledge gap, training American engineers to operate leading-edge lithography processes, proved harder and slower than early schedules had assumed. And even when completed, the Arizona fabs will produce a fraction of the capacity that will remain in Taiwan. What TSMC represents at this moment is a paradox that globalization produced and does not know how to undo quickly. Decades of rational specialization created an extraordinarily efficient value chain. Every node in that chain does what it does best, in the place where it can do it at lowest cost and highest quality. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company sits at the top of that hierarchy precisely because no other actor, not Intel, not Samsung, not any Chinese state project with hundreds of billions invested, has managed to replicate what TSMC built in Hsinchu and across its clusters throughout Taiwan. The efficiency was real. The growth was real. The value created for customers, shareholders, and for the Taiwanese economy was real. In 2024, the semiconductor industry accounted for more than 20% of Taiwan's GDP, a mutual dependence that ties the economic fate of the island to the same industrial cluster that ties the economic fate of the global economy to the island. Chang, in interviews and public appearances in recent years, chose his words carefully when discussing the geopolitical context surrounding the company he founded. He described TSMC as a silicon shield. The idea that the company's strategic value to the United States and the West would make any attempt at disruption militarily too costly to be rationally contemplated. The logic is one of economic deterrence. Destroying TSMC would mean destroying value that China also depends on accessing. That thesis has defenders. It also has critics who argue that economic deterrence is a fragile protection when placed against long-term political objectives that a government is willing to pay a significant price to achieve. What is not in dispute at this point is the structural outline of the problem. A single company, operating from a single island, produces more than 90% of the advanced chips that power the global digital economy. That company operates within a geopolitical context of documented growing tension, one that governments across multiple major powers treat as a first-order national security risk. The policy responses underway, subsidies, new fabs, reshoring, acknowledge the problem but do not resolve it within any relevant time horizon. In Phoenix, Arizona, TSMC's fabs are under construction. In Kumamoto, Japan, the first unit is already operating. In Taipei, Hsinchu, and across the industrial parks extending through Taiwan's interior, the core of the operation continues to run. Orders arrive, machines run, chips ship. The decision that cost billions, in this case, is not a decision that has already produced its full costs. It is a decision whose costs are partially on the books, in subsidies, in delays, in contingency plans that governments develop in silence, and partially still suspended, awaiting a variable that no model can precisely time. The construction plans for the Phoenix fab are part of TSMC's public record. The disruption cost analyses were produced by the Semiconductor Industry Association and the Institute for Economics and Peace, and circulated in congressional hearings and government reports. The Chinese military exercises of 2022 and 2024 were documented by Taiwan's armed forces and by the international press. The market share figures were published by the research firms TrendForce and Counterpoint Research.